So we have a question that was asked over email, and the question was this right here. If you're given this inequality, x times x plus 2 times x minus 4, and you have that, that's bad. Let's see here. Okay, well, you have that less than or equal to 0. And the question was really on how do you enter the inequality notation, the interval notation, into the computer, and I'll address that here at the end, but let's just go through this. If we're going to use the test point method, the first thing that we need to do is actually set this entire expression equal to 0 so that we can find the partition numbers that we're going to use to break our number line up. Okay, so if I set each of these to 0, x equals 0, and x plus 2 equals 0, and x minus 4 equal to 0. And if I solve these, subtracting the 2, I'm just going to get x equals negative 2, and add the 4, and x equals 4. So I actually have 3 values at 4, at negative 2, and at 0 that I'm going to use to break my number line up into. And then I'm going to test different intervals on the number line. Okay, so if we say here's negative 2, and here's 0, and here's negative 2, 0, and then here's 4. And then what I want to do is figure out, am I including these values or not? Because this is a less than or equal to 0, I can include these values. These values give me zeros when I plug them back in. So you can either show that by a closed dot, or you can show it using a bracket as well if you'd like. Okay, so what I'm going to do is and this is called the test point method, I'm going to choose some values in each of these sections here. So one of the intervals is from negative infinity to negative 2. And if I just choose any value in that interval, but not actually one of the zeros, then that will dictate to me when I plug it back in, it'll tell me whether this interval is going to be negative or positive. Okay, so I'll choose negative 3 there. I'll choose negative 1 in the interval from negative 2 to 0. I'll choose positive 1 in the interval from 0 to 4. And then I'll choose 5 in the interval from 4 to infinity. Okay. All right, now when I plug these in, I'm actually going to plug them into this expression right here. And I don't really care so much what the relationship is to 0. Well, I'm just looking for the sign, basically. I don't really care so much what the number is. So if I plug negative 3 in here, and I'll just write this one out for you so you can see what I'm doing. It would be a negative 3 times negative 3 plus 2 times negative 3 minus 4. And what I'm concerned with is I want to know what's the sign on this number right here. Is it going to be positive or negative? Because every number in this interval is going to have that same sign. Okay, so I actually just look at the signs here. This is a negative number. Negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1, so that's a negative number. And this is a negative number. So you take 3 negative numbers and you multiply them together, and you get something negative. So on my number line, I'm going to show that as being negative. Okay. If we take a negative 1 and we plug it in, we're going to have a negative times a positive times a negative. And that would end up being positive. If we take a positive 1 and plug it in, we have a positive times a negative, so that would end up being negative. And take 5 and plug it in, it'll be positive, positive, and positive. So that'll end up being positive. Okay, once you have your number line with your signs on it, you have to decide which portion are you looking for, the greater than or the less than. So when it says less than 0 here, what they're telling me is I'm actually looking for the negative values, because if you're less than 0, then you have to be negative. Okay, so if you notice here, my negative values are occurring from negative infinity to negative 2, and then also from 0 to 4. So if I were to write that out in interval notation, it would look like this. I would go from negative infinity up to negative 2. I would use a parenthesis on infinity, always a parenthesis on infinity. And I use a bracket on negative 2 because I'm including that number. I'm going to union that with 0 out to 4. Okay, and brackets, excuse me, brackets on both 0 and 4 because we're including those numbers as well. Okay. All right, now when you go to enter this into the computer, and that was part of what the question was on, you can actually use the buttons that are on your computer's keyboard. So I'm just going to go into my computer keyboard. You can use these two buttons for the parentheses and these two buttons for the brackets if you want. That will work. It will also work if you use the buttons that are on the computer. There's a button that allows you to, you know, it looks like this in the little box there, and if you click on that, it's actually going to give you the parentheses. You can enter negative infinity here, and then when you come over to this space, you can enter -2. You can enter -2, then you have to actually erase the parenthesis and put a bracket there. And then you can union that with, and actually under the More button, if you go under the More button, then it'll show you some brackets in there, and you can do that also. So there's two ways to enter these answers into the computer. You can either you know, just use what's on your computer, or you can, on the program itself, you can use the parentheses and the brackets that are listed under the More button. Okay.